There's a playbook. It has been used before, not once, not twice, but with a consistency so deliberate, so methodical, so brazenly unapologetic, that calling it a playbook is almost too generous, because a playbook implies some attempt at concealment, some effort to disguise the strategy beneath layers of deniability and diplomatic language. What Vladimir Putin is doing in Moldova right now requires no such concealment. He is doing it in public. He is doing it with decrees published in official Russian government registers. He is doing it with laws passed by the State Duma on recorded votes. He is ministry spokesperson that include phrases like all necessary means delivered at press briefings with full media coverage. He is doing exactly what he did before invading Ukraine, and he is doing it in a country that most of the world cannot find on a map, in a region whose name most people have never heard, involving a territorial dispute whose roots stretch back 2 centuries to a war between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire that most people never studied. Moldova, population 2.6 million, GDP per capita among the lowest in Europe, sandwiched between Romania to the west and Ukraine to the east, home to a frozen conflict that has been simmering since 1992, when a short civil war ended with a ceasefire that resolved nothing and left a strip of Russian-controlled territory, Transnistria, embedded inside Moldovan borders like a splinter that has never been removed. That splinter is now being weaponized. With the same tools, the same language, the same legal mechanisms, the same sequence of escalatory steps that preceded the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And the woman standing between Putin's playbook and its next successful execution is a Moldovan president named Maia Sandu, who has spent 5 years making herself the most inconvenient leader in Europe for Russian imperial ambitions, and who is now fighting, with economic blockades and border controls and EU accession negotiations, to prevent her country from becoming the next entry in the catalog of post-Soviet territories that Moscow has swallowed while the world was paying attention to something else. To understand what Putin is doing in Moldova right now, you have to understand what Moldova is and why it matters in the specific context of Russia's strategic objectives in the post-Soviet space, because Moldova is not just another small European country struggling with poverty and corruption and the legacy of Soviet mismanagement. Moldova is a case study in every mechanism Russia uses to prevent former Soviet states from integrating with the West. And it is a case study that has been running in slow motion for 34 years, long enough to document every step of the playbook with the kind of historical completeness that makes what is happening right now impossible to misread. The roots of the problem trace to 1812, when Bessarabia, the eastern part of it, what was then Moldavia, was ceded to the Russian Empire at the conclusion of a war that Russia won. The Moldovans, historically and culturally, were never settled under Russian rule. Their language is, in any honest linguistic assessment, Romanian. Their cultural orientation, the orientation of the ethnic Moldovan majority, has always pointed west toward Romania rather than east toward Russia. When the Soviet Union began collapsing in 1989, the Moldovans moved toward independence with the urgency of people who had been waiting for this moment for generations. And that is precisely when the current crisis began, because independence meant a Moldovan nationalist project that the Russian-speaking population on the left bank of the Dniester River had every reason to fear. When Moldova passed a law making Moldovan the official language, and replacing the Cyrillic alphabet with the Latin script, the Russian and Ukrainian minorities in Transnistria, people who communicated primarily in Russian, who had built their lives and their political power around the Soviet industrial economy that Transnistria had become, organized resistance. And the Soviet 14th Army, stationed in Transnistria, did not transfer to Moldovan control when Moldova issued the decree requiring it. Boris Yeltsin transferred it to Russian Federation control instead, and then the 14th Army joined the separatists. The short civil war of 1992 ended with a ceasefire that froze a conflict rather than resolving it, leaving Transnistria as a de facto Russian protectorate embedded inside Moldovan territory, complete with 1,500 Russian soldiers stationed at a decommissioned Soviet ammunition depot in the village of Kobazna, guarding what the Academy of Sciences of Moldova determined in 2015 would produce an explosion equivalent to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined if it were struck. 22,000 tons of military equipment, 34 years of ceasefire, zero resolution. That is the situation Putin inherited. That is the frozen conflict that has served Russian strategic interests perfectly for 3 decades by ensuring that Moldova could never fully integrate with the West because a strategically important chunk of its territory was outside its control, and that frozen conflict is now being deliberately unfrozen. The specific mechanism Putin is deploying in Moldova right now is the same mechanism he deployed in eastern Ukraine in the years before the invasion. And understanding the mechanism with precision is essential to understanding why what is happening is not a diplomatic dispute or a bilateral tension or a geopolitical misunderstanding, but the activation of a proven imperial expansion strategy. On May 13th of this year, the Russian State Duma passed a law granting Putin the authority to deploy Russian troops abroad to protect Russian citizens who are arrested, detained, or prosecuted by foreign courts or international judicial bodies not recognized by Moscow. Read that sentence again slowly. Russian troops can now be legally deployed abroad to protect Russian citizens held by foreign courts. Moscow does not recognize the government in Kiev as legitimate. Moscow is moving steadily toward not recognizing the Sandu government in Chisinau as legitimate either. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova made the target of this law unmistakably clear when she stated at a press briefing that any aggression against Russian citizens living in Transnistria will receive an immediate and adequate response, adding that Moscow is prepared to use all necessary means to ensure the safety of the local population. All necessary means. At a press briefing about Moldova. 2 days after that law was passed, on May 15th, Putin signed a decree expediting citizenship applications for residents of Transnistria. Residents over the age of 18 can now obtain Russian citizenship without proving knowledge of the Russian language, Russian history, or Russian legislation, requirements that are normally strictly enforced. They are also exempt from the requirement to have lived in Russia for 5 years before applying. The sequence is the template. First, distribute Russian passports to residents of the territory you intend to eventually control. Then, pass a law that allows you to deploy military force to protect those passport holders. Then, wait for a pretext, a security incident, a diplomatic dispute, an economic measure by the host government that could be characterized as aggression against Russian citizens, and deploy. This is exactly what happened in eastern Ukraine. This is exactly what happened in Crimea. The passports came first. The legal framework for military deployment came second. The intervention came third. Moldova is currently at stage 2. Maya Sandu's response to Putin's escalation is the most important underreported story in European security right now, because Sandu is not simply a pro-Western Moldovan politician making sympathetic statements about EU integration, while hoping that American and European attention to her country's plight will deter Russian aggression. She is a woman who came to power on a platform of anti-corruption and EU integration in 2020. Who has spent 5 years methodically dismantling the Russian leverage points that previous Moldovan governments either maintained because they were genuinely pro-Russian or maintained because the oligarchs who ran them benefited from the gray economy that Russian influence over Transnistria enabled. And she has now, in coordination with Ukraine, begun the most aggressive economic pressure campaign against Transnistria that the region has experienced since the ceasefire. At midnight on January 1st of this year, Ukraine enacted strict controls along its roughly 280-mile border with Transnistria, requiring inspections for any permitted movement of goods or people through the crossing points. Simultaneously, Moldovan authorities strengthened checkpoints and expanded border enforcement, deploying mobile units to support controls beyond fixed crossings. Exactly 2 years earlier, on January 1st, 2024, Sandu's government had imposed taxes on imports and exports to and from Transnistria, a move that the separatist leader Vadim Krasnoselsky described as an economic blockade, and that was, in substance, exactly what he said it was. The economic consequences for Transnistria have been severe and documented. In 2025, Transnistria's economy contracted by almost 18%. Industrial production fell by 27.3%. Foreign trade turnover collapsed by 28.5%. Inflation surged to 14.7%. This is not collateral damage from geopolitical tensions. This is the result of a coordinated, deliberate, legally structured economic strangulation campaign by the US, Moldovan and Ukrainian governments, designed to make the cost of Russian-backed separatism visible and concrete and painful in ways that the previous 3 decades of comfortable frozen conflict had never made it. Sandu understands something that every serious analyst of Russian hybrid warfare has come to understand through painful experience in Georgia and Ukraine. Russia's frozen conflicts are not frozen. They are managed. They are maintained at a level of tension sufficient to serve Russian strategic objectives, blocking EU and NATO integration, without generating the kind of international attention that would force a comprehensive response. The way to unfreeze them is not to wait for Russia to decide the moment is right to escalate. The way to unfreeze them is to make the maintenance of the status quo more costly than its resolution. The economic blockade of Transnistria is Sandu's attempt to do exactly that. And it clearly infuriated Putin enough to trigger the citizenship decree and the military deployment law. The ammunition depot at Kobazna deserves specific and sustained attention because it is the element of this confrontation that most directly threatens regional stability and most directly illustrates why the stakes of what is happening in Moldova extend far beyond the immediate territorial dispute. The depot sits just over a mile from the Ukrainian border. It holds approximately 22,000 tons of military equipment, ammunition, weapons, and material that has been stockpiled there for anywhere from 35 to 75 years. The condition of the stored material is known with certainty only to the Russian and Transnistrian authorities who guard it. Much of it is almost certainly degraded beyond operational use by age and poor storage conditions. But degraded ammunition in an unsecured depot is not safe. It is uniquely dangerous because the same chemical instability that makes decades-old ordnance unreliable in combat makes it prone to catastrophic accidental detonation if it is struck, if it is improperly handled, or if storage conditions deteriorate beyond the threshold at which the material can be safely contained. The Academy of Sciences of Moldova's 2015 assessment that an explosion at Kobazna would be equivalent to the combined nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the number that every policymaker in Chisinau, Kiev, Brussels, and Washington has been living with for a decade. It is not a number that allows for casual risk tolerance. The highly destructive war in Ukraine is being fought literally miles from Kobazna. Every miscalculation, every drone that drifts off course, every artillery shell that falls outside its intended target zone, every piece of debris from an intercepted missile represents a potential trigger for the kind of detonation that the 2015 assessment described. The Moldovans want the weapons and the Russian troops removed. That is the stated, consistent, unambiguous policy preference of the Sandu government. But removal is not possible as long as the war in Ukraine continues, because there is no safe corridor through which the material could be transported. Ukraine is to the north and east, and bringing 22,000 tons of ammunition through an active war zone is not a logistical option that exists in reality. The Ukrainians would, in all likelihood, prefer to destroy the depot, seize the usable equipment, and eliminate the threat. The Russians use the depot as leverage, as a security guarantee that prevents Moldovan military action against the separatist region, as a perpetual demonstration that the consequences of attempting forced reunification would extend far beyond the immediate conflict. It is, in the most literal possible sense, a hostage situation conducted with 22,000 tons of Soviet-era ordnance as the hostage. The demographic reality of Transnistria complicates the clean narrative that both Moscow and Chisinau prefer to present, and understanding it with precision matters for assessing the actual likelihood of the various scenarios that Putin's latest escalation has put on the table. The 2015 census found approximately 475,000 people living in Transnistria. Of those, at least 358,000 possess Moldovan citizenship. Around 220,000 have Russian citizenship, and approximately 100,000 have Ukrainian citizenship. The overlapping numbers reveal that a significant portion of Transnistrian residents hold 2 or more passports, an entirely rational response to living in an unrecognized territory whose own passport is accepted nowhere in the world except Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two unrecognized breakaway regions in Georgia whose international recognition is even more limited than Transnistria's. Sandu's claim that the majority of Transnistrians want to be Moldovan and join the EU has demographic substance. Applications for Moldovan passports from left bank residents rose 50% in 2025 compared to the previous year. The broader trend of the post-2022 period shows significant numbers of Transnistrian residents choosing Moldovan citizenship as Russian military aggression in Ukraine made Russian citizenship a document of increasing liability rather than advantage. But Sandu's narrative requires qualification. The data also shows that 330,538 Transnistrian residents, more than 90% of the current total of Moldovan passport holders in the region, had already received their Moldovan passports by the end of 2020, before the full-scale Ukrainian invasion began. The surge in applications post-2022 is real, but relatively modest compared to the pre-existing baseline. The picture is more complex than either Moscow's narrative of a Russian-aligned population being persecuted by pro-Western authorities or Chisinau's narrative of a population yearning for EU membership being held captive by Russian troops. Transnistria is a region whose population has been living in a gray zone for 34 years, developing pragmatic multi-passport strategies that reflect the specific impossibility of their situation rather than coherent political preferences for one patron or another. Putin's fast-tracked citizenship offer is not primarily about responding to genuine demand from Transnistrians who want Russian citizenship. It is about creating the legal architecture that transforms the population into a resource he can mobilize, either as a justification for military deployment under the new protection law or as potential conscripts for the Ukraine hymn of planning. Her specific accusation That Moscow is conducting a hidden mobilization of the Transnistrian population is entirely consistent with the Russian military's documented manpower requirements, and entirely consistent with the mechanism of the citizenship law that removes age, language, and residency requirements from the application process. There is an element of geopolitical irony embedded in this confrontation that deserves explicit acknowledgement, because it reveals the specific cynicism with which international norms are applied in the post-Soviet space. Romania has long offered expedited citizenship to Moldovans based on shared history and ancestry. Under Article 11 of Romanian law, Moldovans who can prove descent from Romanian or Bessarabian citizens, particularly those who lived in the region before 1940, are eligible for simplified Romanian citizenship. The process typically takes 2 to 3 years, with exemptions from residency and language requirements for many applicants. By 2024, hundreds of thousands of Moldovans, more than a third of the entire population, had obtained Romanian passports through this mechanism, including Maya Sandu herself, who holds Romanian citizenship and has stated she would vote for reunification with Romania if a referendum were held. The mechanism is structurally comparable to Putin's Transnistrian citizenship decree. Both offer expedited citizenship to a population based on historical connection and shared identity. Both remove standard residency and language requirements. Both create political leverage for the offering state over the target territory. The difference, and it is an enormous difference that should not be obscured by the structural parallel, is in the intent and the accompanying measures. Romania's citizenship policy is not accompanied by laws authorizing the deployment of Romanian troops to protect Romanian citizens held in Moldovan courts. It is not accompanied by foreign ministry statements about using all necessary means to protect Romanian citizens in Moldova. It is not accompanied by 1,500 soldiers stationed at a depot containing 22,000 tons of ammunition. It is a citizenship policy. Putin's Transnistrian decree is a citizenship policy embedded within a military deployment legal framework, combined with explicit military threats issued by official foreign ministry spokespersons. The structural parallel is real. The strategic context makes them categorically different instruments. The EU accession context is where Moldova's Transnistria problem connects to Russia's broader strategic objective in the most direct possible way. To meet the Copenhagen criteria that govern EU membership applications, Moldova must demonstrate a stable democracy, a functioning market, economy, and the capacity to implement and uphold EU law throughout its territory. That final requirement, throughout its territory, is the specific phrase that makes Transnistria an existential obstacle to Moldovan EU membership, rather than merely a bilateral territorial dispute. You cannot guarantee universal application of EU requirements, EU judicial standards, EU market rules, EU human rights norms across your entire territory when a strategically important portion of that territory is controlled by a Russian-backed separatist regime with its own security apparatus, its own economic system, its own relationship with Russian state enterprises, and 1,500 Russian soldiers whose continued presence is explicitly intended to prevent exactly the kind of state authority that EU membership requires. The EU has signaled that the existence of an autonomous region does not in itself preclude membership. Cyprus joined the EU with its own unresolved division still in place and remains divided today. But Cyprus joined before the Copenhagen criteria were tightened in 1993. The rules have changed. And the precedent of Cyprus, a country that joined the EU with a frozen conflict that has generated decades of complications for EU foreign policy, that required specific arrangements to manage the acquis, communautaire in the occupied north, and that has periodically held EU decision-making hostage to bilateral disputes with Turkey, is not a precedent that the current EU membership framework is designed to repeat. Russia understands all of this with perfect clarity. The Transnistrian frozen conflict is not valuable to Russia because of what Transnistria is. It is valuable because of what it prevents. It prevents Moldova from meeting the Copenhagen criteria. It prevents Moldova from meeting the territorial requirement for EU membership. It keeps Moldova in the GRE, high zone of European security indefinitely, available for Russian leverage, subject to Russian pressure, dependent on Russian goodwill for the maintenance of a stability that is always provisional and always conditional. Sandu's economic blockade and EU accession drive are a direct assault on this strategy. Putin's citizenship decree and military deployment law are the response. We have seen this confrontation before. We know how it can escalate. The Ukraine parallel is the framework that gives everything happening in Moldova its most alarming dimension, because the parallel is not interpretive. It is structural. It is documented, step by documented step. In Ukraine, the sequence was decades of frozen conflict in Donbas, distribution of Russian passports to residents of the separatist regions, passage of legal frameworks authorizing military deployment to protect Russian citizens abroad, accumulation of Russian military forces at the borders of the conflict zone, a pretext, the alleged persecution of Russian speakers, used to justify military intervention, annexation of Crimea in 2014, full-scale invasion in 2022. In Moldova, the current sequence is 34 years of frozen conflict in Transnistria, existing distribution of Russian passports to a significant portion of the Transnistrian population, passage on May 13, 2026, of a law authorizing military deployment to protect Russian citizens held by foreign courts, not recognized by Moscow, 1,500 Russian soldiers already in position at Kobasna with 22,000 tons of military equipment, foreign ministry statements using language, all necessary means. That is the standard Russian diplomatic formulation preceding military action. Moldova is currently at the stage that Ukraine was at approximately 2013, the moment before Yanukovych's rejection of the EU association agreement triggered Maidan, which triggered Crimea, which ultimately triggered everything that followed. The specific catalyst that triggers the next step in Moldova's version of this sequence is not predetermined. It could be a Moldovan or Ukrainian action against Russian citizens in Transnistria that Moscow characterizes as aggression. It could be a continued economic blockade that produces sufficient hardship in Transnistria to justify a humanitarian intervention framing. It could be a provocation manufactured by Russian intelligence services inside Transnistria designed to create the pretext that the legal and military architecture now in place is ready to respond to. What it will not be is surprising, because the playbook is published. The steps have been announced, the laws have been passed, the decrees have been signed. The only question is whether the international community's awareness of the playbook, this time sharpened by 4 years of watching it execute in Ukraine at catastrophic cost, is sufficient to produce the deterrent response that was absent before Crimea was annexed and absent before the tanks crossed the border in February 2022. The implications of what Putin is doing in Moldova extend far beyond the country's borders in ways that the geopolitical conversation has not adequately addressed. Moldova's EU accession is not just a bilateral relationship between Chisinau and Brussels. It is a test case for the credibility of the EU's enlargement project as a stabilizing force in post-Soviet Europe. If Russia can successfully use the Transnistrian frozen conflict to indefinitely block Moldovan EU membership, deploying the citizenship and military deployment mechanisms to escalate whenever Moldova makes meaningful progress toward the Copenhagen criteria, it establishes a replicable template for blocking every other former Soviet state's Western integration ambitions. Georgia has its own frozen conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, established through the same playbook. Armenia is navigating the aftermath of its military defeat in Nagorno-Karabakh. Belarus is already fully within Moscow's orbit. Kazakhstan and the Central Asian states are watching what happens to Moldova and adjusting their own calculations about how much Western integration is achievable before triggering a Russian response that their limited military capacity cannot manage. The EU and NATO's response to Moldova's situation is therefore being watched by every government in the post-Soviet space with a directness and an urgency that Western policymakers need to match with their own responses. The $760 million emergency. Weapons sale to Gulf states that the Trump administration approved in the Iran context demonstrates that American resolve to defend partners against aggressive neighbors is not absent from the current administration's policy toolkit. The question is whether that resolve will extend with equal urgency to a European gray zone where the aggressor is Russia and the targeted country is a democracy actively pursuing EU membership through legitimate legal processes. Maya Sandu is not asking for NATO membership. She is constitutionally constrained from seeking it by Moldova's requirement for a national referendum that polling consistently shows would fail. She is asking for EU membership, for economic support, for diplomatic backing that makes the cost of Russian aggression against Moldova explicit and enforceable. She is asking the international community to recognize what is happening. The same playbook, the same steps, the same legal architecture, the same military positioning, the same language about protecting Russian citizens, and to respond differently than it responded when the playbook was running in Ukraine before 2014. The response it gives in the next weeks and months will determine whether Moldova becomes the next entry in the catalog of countries that discovered. Too late that watching a playbook execute from a distance is not the same as stopping it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is moving faster than the headlines suggest. We will be right here when the next step lands. See you in the next one.